Okay, I think it's good time to start. Okay, so big thank you and welcome to you all for coming to this research seminar series organized by us here. One second. By the within the MOSAIC research group for multilingualism in the School of Education, and we're hosting a question and answer and viewing screening of this really interesting work that's been done by Claire French and Sibusiso Mkhize. Is that right? We're really delighted to have you here for this question and answer. There's just a couple of things before we get going in full kind of like full in its fullest sense. This event is being recorded, so we can share it with anyone who couldn't attend. As you will notice, we've made this closed captioning. So where possible, if you could just speak a little slowly so the captions have time to kind of catch up to make this as accessible as possible. So we're delighted to have Claire Sibusiso here. My name is Kamran Khan, and I'm an associate professor here at the University of Birmingham. So this is a kind of joint interdisciplinary event, which we're very much interested in. I have to confess, I'm a somewhat beginner in terms of visual arts and performances, but I'm really interested and excited. And I was very happy when Claire approached us about this event. Everything sounded so interesting about this. So it's a really good, interesting opportunity to see the kind of the way multilingualism and visual arts work together. And we see this in practice with this video and with the kind of everything that goes behind this. So Claire, is it worth introducing? Do you want to say hello at this point before we put the screening on? Is there, or should we get into this?
Yeah, I mean, just informally, I'm over here at the Drama and Theatre Arts Department at the University of Birmingham, and this project was developed in 2021 as the result of a postdoctoral project at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, funded by Arts Research Africa. So there's a little bit of a sense of where it's coming from, but we'll have much more of a chance for discussing it after the film.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Just to let you know how this is organized, then we'll have the actual screening shortly, which I'll just share the screen with you all. We'll have some question and answers which I will share, and then we'll have a kind of open space for people to kind of share experiences and also to ask interesting questions to our kind of guests here. So shall I get this started and put the screening on?
Yeah, Sibusiso, would you like to do a welcome?
Oh, yes. Greetings to everyone present. My name is Sibusiso Mkhize, and I'm a theatre practitioner, musician, director, actor, mentor. Currently working as a sessional staff at the University of the Witwatersrand under the Theatre and Performance Department, where I teach musical theatre and performance. I also teach at an academy, a school called Sibusiso Arts Center, which is in Benoni. So I don't know if we are still opening with song, Claire?
Yeah.
Is what you're alluding to? Okay. It's just a small, nothing big. It's just a small song just to open this webinar. Yeah, it goes like this. Oh, zanginchele nansindaba bantwana bami. Oh, zanginchele nansindaba bantwana bami. Indaba bantwana bami lalelani. Daba bantwana bami lalelani osangitshele nansi indaba bantwana bami osangitshele nansi indaba bantwana bami indaba bantwana bami lalelani indaba bantwana bami lalelani. Yes, so with that song, that is a welcome from myself. So loosely translated, the song is simply saying, come, let me tell you a story, my children, you know, a story, listen, as I'm about to tell you. Yes, thank you.
Wow, thank you. That's a very fitting way to start this. So I think this is the logical point where we can share this short film and documentation of this performance at this point. So I'm just going to just access this now. It's ready to go, and I'll share the screen.
Wahlalwa phansi kwaxoxwa kwahlelwa konke
umqhelekanina igugu likayise uvuyo oluhle lwabo bobabili inkanyezi eqhakazisa konke fumbathiswa kona inkanyambe mamatheka ichobozele uma icabanga ikusasa lizokhanya yize ubumnyama kuyisinkwa sayo semihla ngemihla wena Phumalanga Sikothe into egeza ngobisi into enoboya ebusweni ophophozelayo awuyona imbokodo ulidwala ehlenga okwesikhukhukazi sigade amatswele impande zakho zagcotshwa ngondendende wesimilo ukuyikhandla ukunyamezela kanye nokwethembeka uyingane yethonga ephila impilo zimbili ingwiji khwebu kepha eyisithombe esisobala.
ha ke ipolela ke re ke mokubung wa mahwete komane kubu ntsha marota re bone kubu hlapa tse potlana di hlapa di a nyolosa madiba tse kgolo di a se fela ke motho wa bodiba botala ha bo okamelwe marakwe a bo okamela a wela ka mahlana le ditsejana le mongomo be batho ba monaheng e reng kometsi a jele a hlatse kometsi ga di firi tsa phirimana se bouledi se bouletseng motse wa ntataye motse wa Manoka le Mankekele ha o se ha thebetse o re o lekisa mang o lekisa tshweu le Ramohlabudi Chobolo echaba ya bomukoloko kubo tata wa Ramuitheri Phula le Manamane kubu ntshamarota re bone
Yijani uthabetha koduduka nomfazi onangabela amado wami ngisumntwana ngale kweligwane ligwana bayangicala bathi ngubani na bathi ngundlelehle umrazana eRebele izibulo ngakwabo fuzuni nabewecela into le nginyebeleni bayabuza bonyana wenza ngani Bagcanda bazi bonyana ngisizukulwana semajalini. Abogogo nabo bamkhulu bayangikhambela ngaphambili ngemuva nengemaqadi. Zithi ngemegeme ziza, zigijima njengombane wezulu zingithole ngizibuyile. Njengephiko ekarisa ngamaphiko wabo. Ngizalwa nguKarisa, umrazana kaMkoneni, owangifukamela njengedzinini lakhe. Qala nje, ngimuhle, ngihlakaniphile, begodwa ngiyakarisa. Ngabe ngiyaphosisana ngithi konke lokhu kungokuhlakanipha kwami namandla ami, kodwana kungamandla kaZimu nabezimu. Zithande Ndebele, uthande noseqadi wakho, uthande umuntu onzima, umkakarela, umunye lonke ilwazi, begodwa ungakhohlwa la uvela khona.
Wena uyasiwe ma wazalwa bufumbethe, ungukhethi uyanqotshwa yini. Oh, uyasiwe mazulwini, wazalwa bufumbethe kuyalwa impi. Wena ungukhethi uyanqotshwa yini. Uyasiwe mazulwini, wazalwa bufumbethe kuyalwa impi. Wena ungukhethi uyanqotshwa yini.
Okay, so that's breathing through the feet. We should say as well, if anyone had any difficulties catching that, it's going to be available to rewatch if you so wish. But it's such an interesting kind of video and project. So, you know, this event is organized for a Global Language Advocacy Day, but I kind of want to ask Claire, you know, to go back, you know, how did this project come about? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've just put my email address in the sidebar because I was experiencing some bandwidth issues, I think. So it was quite glitchy and the music didn't seem to flow with the vision. That wasn't the film, that was the the kind of bandwidth. So if that was your experience, please just send me an email. I can send it to you via a link. So yeah, the background, as I mentioned, it was at the University of Witwatersrand, and it was so the postdoctoral project was called Decolonizing Language Ideologies in the Body. And the idea of it came from some research that I'd done beforehand, which was in South Africa for a number of years, and part of my PhD work actually. And over and over again, working with multilingual practitioners, both the director and the actors seemed still quite inhibited by what was so-called proper or standardized language forms and language practices. So I started to be privy to someone's work, Misha de Vet at the University of Witwatersrand. No, it was at City Varsity at that time, actually, which is also in Johannesburg. And she was working with a choreographer who was a New York-based choreographer named Mary Overley. And she developed a set of compositional tools, Mary Overley did, that are along the lines of space, shape, story, movement, emotion. They're basically areas in which actors can draw from once they've kind of explored them and learned about them and kind of what they might mean in improvisation. And so Misha developed these with actors and kind of adapted them for their local context. And for the first time, I started seeing actors draw from language practices which they hadn't drawn from beforehand. And so I started to feel like, okay, improvisation is certainly a way of introducing more everyday language practices of the actors into the institution. And maybe these viewpoints from Mary Overley are a way forward for further exploring that in a South African context. So that's what the postdoc was mainly aiming to do. And so I was working with the wonderful Samuel Ravangai, who was my mentor for the project, and he introduced me to Sibusiso. And we worked together for about 3 months on a reading group that we developed for ourselves, where he sent me texts and I sent him texts. And the idea is to explore training in Mary Overley's viewpoints, which were also speaking from the cultural and linguistic parameters of Sibusiso's life as well. So that was quite an interesting journey, because it was online at the time in 2021. And then we participated in workshops together and held discussions about how these viewpoints might be further adapted. And we were using the word decolonised at the time. For his context, for isiZulu context, as well as the various languages that were spoken by his peers at the University of the Witwatersrand. And after that 3 months, Sibusiso then set up a project for 6 weeks, which consisted of a consciousness-raising process with 3 actors, where they basically spoke about their experiences within a very English-only or monolingual institution, such as the University of the Witwatersrand, where they hadn't been able to incorporate any of their languages into any of their performance or theatre work over their degrees. And of course, that's changing, and that department is very much being spearheaded by Ravangai at the moment, to invite the linguistic and embodied resources of the South African students into the room. But this was still their experience. And while they were sharing it, they were also developing kind of a new lingua franca and a new understanding of intelligibility, in that they were speaking in isiZulu, in isiNdebele and seSotho. And all of them share linguistic resources and speak parts of each other's languages, but were speaking their own first language, what they understood as their first language. So at the beginning, there was less intelligibility, and they were like explaining words to one another and also using words in new ways, because they hadn't kind of intellectually engaged with their languages in this context, in talking about theatre and performance in such a deep way. Well, that's what some of them have fed back, and Sibusiso is going to speak to that. And then Sibusiso introduced the viewpoints and his understanding of rhythm in relation to that, and also as a framework for the viewpoints. And then they began exploring it on the grounds of the University of the Witwatersrand, which is where the film has been filmed from Sibusiso, walking around while the actors were improvising. So the film is very much a piece of improvisation. When you're first watching it, if you're not used to this type of compositional tool or method or technique, it's a bit alienating, because you're like, okay, what am I watching here? Is it performance? Is it performance art? Is it a film? And it's because we're very much kind of looking at that process as a performance in itself, but also as something that we can share to start a discussion about these processes as a step toward actors, as very much language advocates, exploring their languages within performance, which will then obviously convert to stages and screens around the world. I think I've covered most of the elements of it being set up. Sibusiso, do you have anything to add in relation to that?
No, I think you've covered most of the points relating to the work. But I mean, I think for me, a big part of this project was a decolonial kind of process, right? An exercise, to really conscientize the self, and the spaces in which we find ourselves in, which are very much colonial. But I mean, when you look at, I've shared the story with Claire, but when I was still a student at Wits, I remember we had a situation where one of my peers wanted to do a play in isiZulu, and she couldn't, and part of that was the lecturer's inability to to understand the language. But, you know, what was said is that it really, you know, was not beneficial to the student, because the work that she wanted to produce, you know, really needed her to express herself in isiZulu. So she found herself having to do work which was not firstly what she intended to do, but also there was no expression of the self, of herself into the work, you know. So these are the kind of challenges that we encountered as students. But to be quite honest, the theatre and performance department at Wits, you know, is progressively moving towards, you know, a decolonial kind of approach to the work that we do to performing arts, which is pleasing, you know, and it's pleasing for me as well, finding myself in a space where I, you know, was taught, now I'm teaching, but also to teach what I was not taught, I think for me is also a very powerful thing. So I think, yeah, generally for me, and it does also tie in with my master's research, where I'm looking at musical theater, but obviously focusing, you know, on African and Black aesthetics, you know, finding African ways of how to, and African methods rather, of how to, you know, create musicals or musical theater, of how to approach, you know, a musical piece, especially, you know, from the perspective of a musical director.
Thank you so much. And Sibusiso, I was interested in the role of English, and particularly this line, I breathe English, but I do not live it. So, I mean, I've seen this video a few times, and that always stands out to me. Tell us a bit more about that and how English affects you and your friends and your family and your kind of peers in that respect.
I think I've briefly just touched on it. You know, You know, it hinders the expression of self. Because when you really look at the power of our languages, you know, or the power embedded rather in our languages, it's really you know, incredible. Because, for example, let's look at the idea of rhythm. You know, firstly, I remember when we started the project, when we were talking about isiq, which is rhythm. You know, you find that, you know, there are different rhythms in different cultures. But what we also found to be very common, you know, was the rhythm of the heart, you know, using the heartbeat, you know, which is something that connected us, which is also what we found our languages to do. So, you know, the power that our languages hold, you know, from you know, thinking about the images, you know, when you're illustrating, you know, if I had to say to you something will never happen, in my language, I'll say, Liyowa liqoshwe izinkukhu, meaning the sun will fall and the chickens will pick it up. You know, that is something that will never happen, you know. So to use such an expression, you know, is expressive enough to show you, you know, if I mean that, you know, something will never happen. So, you know, to really find yourself, you know, in spaces that were very hegemonic, you know, it hinders the expression of self. Because then there's so much that you want to do. Because, you know, when we create, and when I create, I always create from within. And at most times, you know, I love to create in isiZulu. And, you know, when I'm cheated of that opportunity, then I'm cheated of an opportunity to express who I am, right? Because, you know, the brain that is within, you know, also holds the politics of the self. So also, if I'm not given an opportunity to express myself in isiZulu, then I'm also not given an opportunity to express the politics in which, you know, that I hold, that represent who I am. But I mean, definitely, you know, it's been, because at times you also find yourself coming into university like Wits, and you're bombarded with, you know, like, you know, academic jargon, you know, academic books, and sometimes the English is overwhelming. It's really overwhelming. So you're finding yourself firstly having to understand the language before you even understand the content that has been taught. right? So it's like a double process that you have to go through, which sometimes also hinders, the process of learning. So, I mean, to really find yourself, which is what we're doing now, like I said, with the theatre and performance department, to really start inviting African languages into the curriculum, into the work, into the content that we teach, it's really inviting the self, because the education that we receive needs to look like us, right? It's problematic if I'm being taught something that doesn't resemble who I am. So when the work that I'm doing resembles who I am, there's a connection, there's a better flow of understanding in terms of what I do, right? And I mean, even the engagement and the giving in of the self becomes a much more easy process. So really, English has been that, hegemonic. So I mean, I breathe it because I find myself in those spaces that are hegemonic. It's like finding yourself. I mean, I'm not here also to speak of it as if it's a bad language, but I mean, we're talking about it in the context of the work that we've just done, because also language is a political tool. It's a political tool that we use, as artists. So to find yourself in those hegemonic spaces is like finding yourself, in a room full of smoke. You breathe it because that is what the space holds. But actually, the life that you live is not, the breath that we are taking. So also that in and of itself creates a bit of a discrepancy. It creates a bit of, it doesn't allow an easy flow of the self to really express who they are.
Thanks, Sibusiso. I was also interested in your in the role as a director in this project, and what was the kind of did you have an audience in mind, or how did you go about kind of directing it in relation to a kind of a possible audience in mind?
So when I assume the role of a director, whether I'm a musical director or I'm directing a performance, I think the role of the director sits within the name itself, a director, to give direction. So also what I've found, right, is that when I was a student, the kind of directing that we were given, I found it to be quite, problematic, because, we need, firstly, for me, I believe that actors or performers, if I'm working with talent, they have minds, they can think, but also over and above that, they have, this fire that I was talking about. They have an impulse within, that tells them what to do. Most of the times when we do our work, we connect, on a spiritual level. So you are dealing with beings that are spiritual, that have a spiritual connection, that have a spiritual guide, to guide them to really explore and be. So what you therefore become as a director is to give direction in that work, right? You allow, actors to really express themselves. Sam Okala speaks about it when he speaks about one of the laws, which is free enactment. So I really allow performers to enact, in a very free manner, understanding also in the same law, Semukala speaks about responsibility, they have a responsibility to carry out the task. But it's just allowing the actors to be free, allowing the actors to express themselves, allow them to really give what they want to give. With the project, I gave a task, but then I gave people freedom of choice to say, go write, find a poem, write something, that really represents or speaks about who you are in your own language. And to that, let's find movement, let's find a dance. And if you look at the work also, we involved a lot of improvisation, because if you think about ancient times, from ancient storytelling, African storytelling, the storyteller used to improvise, but where you're improvising from that impulse, from that burning impulse from within, right? But also you understand that the language that you're speaking, and that's why we're saying we're breathing through the feet, the relationship between the ground and the feet also evokes a sense of a rhythm. It evokes a sense of an impulse, which then lives in the body and allows the performer to be. Also, similarly, Hendrik in the book, Black Acting Methods, the book speaks about Hendrik's method. And one of the things that Hendrik's did, was to, make huge musicals with no script. So, through improv, the actors would, find the lines as they are going. And, I love what they say. They coin it as embodied script. So the script becomes embodied, and those are some of the processes that I use when I create work. I really allow the performer to give themselves into the process, and also to give offers. And then what I do as a director is to give direction, because I have the vision, but I mean, you need a collective of people to help you with that vision. And the last point, something that I've always also found to be quite problematic, was this idea of blocking. You'll hear a lot of that says, let's block a scene. That in and of itself is problematic if you look at the word blocking, it blocks. Right. So these are things I try and do away from. I believe in free enactment. I believe in actors, freely giving themselves. And from that, as a director, you give direction.
That's so interesting. I was always interested in the balance between improvisation and direction there. I'm just gonna, I can see Catherine has got a hand up. So Catherine, did you want to jump in here?
Thank you very much indeed, Sibusiso and Claire. It's really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to watching it again and again so I can get a better understanding. But I was just very interested. I think I hope I caught it correctly. Something at the beginning which seemed to be talking about how this was developed in dialogue. I don't know if I got that right, and what you were talking about, how you were creating it. But I was just wondering if I did get that right, that it was the importance of dialogue. I was wondering how it was co-created within that sense of dialogue, and presumably dialogue which was probably partly linguistic but also partly physical and so on. So I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that, in the hope that I haven't mistaken what was said at the beginning.
Sibu, are you happy to answer that, or do you want me to?
I mean, we found out. I mean, it was a very challenging time, to be quite honest, because there was lockdown happening in South Africa, and there was load shedding, and we found ourselves using so many mediums to kind of communicate. Most of the work happened virtually. Sometimes I couldn't join in virtually, so we had to communicate through voice messages, to a point where we used to send like 15-minute long voice messages. And I'd be sitting at night on my bed just listening to an entire mixtape given to me by Claire, right? And I think that was the medium of how we kind of exchanged ideas and found some kind of common ground into what we wanted to do, right? I remember also when we were recording the footage, I had a computer put right at a far distance, and Claire was, kind of voyeuristic into the work, through a kind of virtual call, and I was moving around with the camera. So, I mean, that has been kind of the medium of communication. And also quite, I mean, interestingly enough, I mean, even now, the idea of English is still prevalent even in us, how we are communicating in this medium, in this space, that we're finding ourselves in. So English also played a role in how we communicated, and how, kind of Claire shared ideas or viewpoints, and how I was translating my kind of work to her. Yeah, and did it play a role? Well, I guess it did. I mean, what would the project have been if maybe we were conversing in isiZulu? We don't know, right? But yeah, these are the kind of yes.
Yeah, I think there's the what and the how, right? And so the what at that time was that we were trying to work out how these viewpoints can almost kind of disinhibit, or I use the word disinhibit, so I'll go with it, the actor to not be so bounded by their language ideologies or socially shared beliefs around what languages should be used and how in theatre and performance. And so that was the what, but then the how, and we were able to reflect on this at the end, that we were sitting in, because of the digital environment that I was in, I made it very clear to actors, please continue to speak in isiZulu, isiNdebele, or seSotho. And if there are any times that I need to translate, because I'm really not following, then the translators will work with me on that. And that really freed people up. Eventually, the actors kind of became more comfortable by the end. And some of our evaluation discussions were like incredibly great examples for translanguaging in an institutional context. And Sibusiso and I, when we had our reflections, were like, oh, why didn't we make our initial training period more like that? And obviously, because it was one-on-one, and because I still had a training position, like even though it was dialogic or reciprocal, I still was trying to impart some of my knowledge about the overlays viewpoints. I still was kind of bounded by that, and knowing that we would get to the multilingual project, but kind of still inhibited, myself. So that's certainly something that we would like to continue to open up. Like, how could we have a one-on-one dialogue when I've got some very basic lexical understanding of isiZulu, not really any grammatical understanding. So how do you do that, right? Does that kind of start to answer your question, Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't exactly sure what I was asking, because I wasn't quite sure what I'd picked up, but it's interesting to hear what you've both said. I suppose it is very, yeah, it's so multi-layered, isn't it? And so complex, actually, what you've been working through. And I think it's very interesting coming from a perspective, working in Wales, as Bethan, who's with me as well here from Iaith, and myself do, then we're very much used to thinking of, we're very much used to thinking about how, on a daily basis, how you deal with hegemony and where Welsh has legitimacy or not, and voices and all this sort of thing, and ways of being in our language and things like that. But it's very exciting to see it from another cultural perspective. So I think it's really, really fascinating, because I'm very aware that, our approach to language rights, language freedoms and things like that in the Welsh context are very much shaped by our local context, and what is, very much a Western, Northern European approach. So it's very interesting, I think, another layer of dialogue, I think, between what you're doing in your context and how we think about language for, and how language is, I can think of those students having a similar experiences in context here, where, there's no space for doing what you want to do in your own way of expressing it. So I think it's fascinating. So yeah, thank you for your explanation of what you've been doing.
Thank you. Over back to you, Cameron.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I can see Helen has been waiting to ask a question, I guess. So I'll pass over to Helen.
Hello, yeah, I'm probably going to come in at quite a different angle, because I'm thinking that you're all academics and I am a teaching practitioner. I teach in a primary school in Southeast UK, and I'm a languages teacher. So my job is to teach French within a school where the school language is English. And my kind of what's my underlying kind of mission, my secret mission, is to try. I was interested what you were saying about language and power, and is trying to give voice to the number of children we have in the school whose first language isn't English. We've got a hugely diverse pupil population in terms of languages and cultures, and I was interested too about what you were saying about audience, because I wondered whether school audiences was something that you might have considered when making the film. For example, I lead a languages day, which is a day when we invite parents and pupils to share home and heritage languages. And I could imagine, I do an assembly at the beginning of that, and I could imagine that film very much at the beginning of a day where children really are thinking about the languages that they live. So really, yeah, that's it. That's my question really is about school audiences, I think.
I would love to add something first. Yeah, I think, do you know what I would love? I would love for them to be able to see that or something like that, and then start to explore themselves, you know, and just kind of get up and in the assembly and walk around, and you could say something like, okay, now think about what how your mum said goodbye to you this morning when you went to school, and say it out loud, you know, and just have a chance for the students to say their language in a public institutional space where it might not have been kind of just the question asked, I suppose. And that's, I think that's the invigorating part of this type of work, is that it is participatory, and yeah, we're drawing from actor training techniques or dance training, but that it's really about kind of working out how we can start to think more in the body as a kind of a temporary substitute for the body then teaching us things. Because that's the thing, this is what I love about this process, is that the actors kind of, they watch themselves and they stand on film, or, you know, they've reflected throughout the performance, and they stand back and they go, oh yeah, I said that at that time, or I did that with my body, and oh yeah, isiZulu can be really poetic in that way, and I couldn't have accessed that part of my body if it weren't for that poem playing in the background, because that helped me tap into those cultural resources. So like, it is kind of this reflective process that will then feed into the real world. That's what we hope, right? Outside of the play space of the theatre. So this is a kind of, and Sibusiso might have something to say in regards to this, but it's this kind of product versus process mentality within theatre and performance, where it's like, I like to invite people into the process as much as possible and kind of go, how can we use these processes in everyday life? Or how can kind of we use one element of them to open us up and help us think in new ways. Sibu?
No, definitely. I was working on, when was it? Last week, Friday, Thursday, I can't remember the day. I mean, whenever I teach, whenever I work, whenever I create, I always tell students or actors or performers that process is paramount over product, all right? If you don't pay attention to the process, you know, you've done yourself a disservice in terms of the product that you want to present. And especially because, you know, I strongly believe that the work that we do is very spiritual. And on certain days, it demands a lot. Sometimes it demands, you know, less. Sometimes it just doesn't need anything, right? So you really need to be sensitive also as a creator, you know, be sensitive to the process, be able to know. And sometimes you need to understand that processes have a way of dictating themselves. And sometimes when you are product orientated, you may kind of, you know, interrupt the process, you know, because I believe that processes have their own lives, right? But I mean, as I was working with the students, there's something that you also touched on, Claire, right? Which is the fact that the body has a mind of its own. And sometimes, you know, we find that the cognitive is always interfering with the body, with the impulses of the body. You know, they were struggling to get into a scene. And it really needed them to tap into a very spiritual space. And all I did was to play a sound, you know, drums, and I just told them to move for 10 minutes, just move. just react to the sound, allow your body to react to the sound. And it was so beautiful what came out of that, right? You know, the journey that each performer went through by just allowing the body, the language of, because the body has its own language, right? Which is, yeah, you know, it doesn't what's the word I'm looking for? It doesn't subscribe, it doesn't go according to any kind of hegemonic. I mean, it can sometimes, but I mean, you know, sometimes when you become too cognitive and think about things, you know, they block the impulses of the body. But it was so beautiful. And then with that became their process, right? With allowing them to really allow the body to live, allow the body to express, you know, the body to interact with the process. That became their process. And from that, I mean, I went to go see them today, you know, from where they were last week to where they are today, beautiful, by just allowing the body to live and to speak and to move.
I think it's exactly because of that reason that I'm thinking about the children that I work with, because of the spiritual aspect and the corporal aspect, and the very direct kind of physical connection, and like you say, kind of moving beyond the cognitive processes that we get caught up in when we're trying to talk about language and trying to teach language and trying to fit language into tiny boxes that in sort of little curriculum hours and that kind of thing. I see it as something that could work very well for children, and with perhaps workshops and teacher training, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really nice idea. Let's keep the space open. Kamran, we want to continue?
Yeah, am I correct, Marilyn? Did you have a question? I could see your hand go up, so.
Yeah, just listening to the conversation and seeing the video and hearing both Claire and Sibusiso speak so eloquently, I was just really reminded of the need to get away from the idea of language as a sort of fixed code, and to pluralize it, but both pluralize multilingualism, because there are different kinds of multilingualisms, but also to pluralize the idea of language as well, bringing in all the resources we have at that are resources that are embodied, multimodal, as well as linguistic. We have lots and lots of kinds of ways of engaging in semiosis in different contexts. So yeah, it's something to be celebrated. And this video captures it very well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Does anybody else want to ask any questions at this point?
I think I would love to talk a bit about the process of making the film, just to kind of provide some clarity on, on how Sibusiso put this together with the actors, if that's of interest.
That'd be great. That'd be really interesting to know.
Sibusiso?
So, I mean, I did touch on it briefly. So it was really about expressing who you are through your language and allowing the body to connote that as well. So I took the performers in, and you'll help me, Claire, right, if there's some information that I'm missing.
Yeah.
But we had a discussion about viewpoints and how it relates to them and what their understanding of viewpoints is. And I had a friend of mine, Moeketsi, Kgotle, the percussionist and the one who recites in seSotho, who had, engaged with viewpoints. Then we started to really dissect these different elements, viewpoint elements, and what was beautiful is exactly what Claire said, when the discussions went from English to seSotho, Ndebele, and Zulu, so much was revealed. And I think it was from those conversations that we had, that we segued into the practical, creation of the work. So one of the things that we went with was the heartbeat. And, from the heartbeat, Moeketsi kind of devised a rhythm, with the djembe drum. And really the approach was write this piece of poem in seSotho, isiZulu, and isiNdebele that expresses and that shows who you are, who you truly are, or how you want to be seen. And as they were reciting, then came the movement. And the movement was really a communication, a conversation that was happening between the sound of the drum, the sound of the poem, the feet and the ground. And as I said earlier on, it was really, sometimes we think improv is just do what you want. But I think improv in this sense was really the idea of free enactment, really the idea of freeing the self, freeing that impulse that I've been talking about, in creating the film. So then we took recordings. Firstly, we had oral recordings of the poems, which I sent to Claire, which we then had to kind of give a translation of them. And then we went to the ground, right? And we started recording these dances, and obviously recording that as well as video format, and I would send them to Claire to kind of compile the entire project. So yeah, it was really that process of creation. But and I think when we speak about process as well, we are also inviting the ideas of a journey, right? Because I don't love the fact that we are on a journey to self-discovery. I would love for us to be born knowing who we are. But because of these hegemonic, structures and institutions that we find ourselves in, there's always a sense of self-discovery, which means we need to go back to really understand who we are. And I think progressively, futuristic kind of thinking, I would love to see, especially within the context that I'm in, people being born knowing who they are, so that we don't find ourselves having to rediscover or be on a journey of discovery, right? Obviously, there are things that you'd have to go back and unpack, but now I'm speaking from a more cultural, more political kind of context, especially with language and the identity of self. I think that's one of the things that I think the work also kind of did, where the performers in and of themselves had to go back home. I know Moeketsi, for example, had to go home and find the kind of explanation for the poem, right? And Nonhlanhla and Nomvuyo to a certain extent. So with me then coming with the song, that is a song that I've just written, loosely written, that speaks to the idea that when you are born with a gift, and you need to really take it and share it with everyone. And I think this is what this poem, this film is about. It's really a platform where we are sharing talent, but also where we are coming together, being joined by the different rhythms of our languages, which at the end of the day form one rhythm, which is the rhythm of the heart.
Yeah, and this conceptualization of rhythm was like a framework for how the actors understood all of the other viewpoints, so space and shape. And so for example, space, they were on the grounds of the University of the Witwatersrand outside, and there were students walking by. So their languages were being amplified through the speaker and they were talking about themselves in these poems on the grounds of the university, with people coming and going. And then they were each responding to the poems in their bodies, but also thinking about space. So there were birds, and there was sound, and there was a sound coming from there, and there was also a lot of sun some days. So you'd see the actors also play with the sun that's coming through the trees. So it was like that's a use of space, for example, and you kind of seeing these different elements as like different stimuli for your improvisation, but then that was all encapsulated within rhythm, and seeing kind of rhythm as an articulating structure whereby all of these things are somehow controlled by a time in essence, but also the rhythm and the intervals that are found in time in order to create the rhythm. And that was just really interesting and something that I hadn't really experienced in other contexts. And I really enjoyed how Sibusiso framed that for the actors. And then, yeah, sorry.
Oh, no, you can continue.
There was something else I wanted to add to make things clear around the performances. So they're both responding to their own poems in their body in interaction with the other actors, as well as the other actors. So there was a kind of this cyclical process of legitimization as well, as they would see their peers responding to their poems on the back lawns of the institution. There are just so many kind of different layers there of seeing and reflecting and re-seeing and reconceptualizing language ideologies that they had previously held about Black South African languages being home languages and what that might mean as like a term, right? It's like, okay, well, why is this just in the home? It's creating such beauty in this performance with my peers. So there's kind of there's enormous opportunities there for the actors' individual kind of changes and new recollections of their languages. Anything?
I just wanted to jump in when you were talking about space, on one of the days when we were recording, because Moeketsi was playing the drum, one of the students, so we were recording next to a student res. So one of the students, complained and said the drum is too loud. It was just an interesting thing to note, in the process. But also when we speak about space, it's also the fact that it was a public performance. And I mean, I don't think, Claire, I got to show you this, but some of the students that were walking past, the way in which they were engaging with the work was interesting. It felt, it had also an alienating feel to it. It felt as if we were doing something very strange, being on the school premises, beating the drum and dancing and then all of those things. But when you actually think about it, we were drawing from, kind of ancient practices of ritual practice, right? Because at no point were we rehearsing the dance, at no point was, as much as we had a rhythm for the drum, but also Moeketsi had moments of, expressing, finding different rhythms within the rhythm that is set, so the work was really organic. The work was really ritualistic. And also, just to add part of that, we had two students when we were recording this other day that came to us. I think we shared this with you, Claire, who came to us and told us that, and actually thanked us for the performance. One of the students shared how heavy she was feeling that day, but the beating of the drum and the movements really kind of healed her. And for me, it just shows, that the kind of work that we also do, this film is not just, talent, movement, and all of those things, but it really sits in a very special spiritual space. Because we are not trying to do anything. We are being ourselves, and we are expressing ourselves, from the most kind of organic space, and connecting really spiritually with how we feel and who we are, and that has a way of resonating with the people around us.
Thank you. I can see Ella Wright, who says, I'm just going to read the message. Apologies, I have no camera or microphone. I come from the film department at Birmingham. My research is focused on videographic practice, exploring the audiovisual video as a means of embodiment and a way of thinking and language itself. So I would love to hear if you have any thoughts on the filmed aspect of the process, perhaps the differences you may have felt between acting a performance in the theatre or live sense versus filming and creating a video out of that. and if that in any way relates to the different spoken languages involved. I'm looking at videos, a pre-linguistic process, and whether you may have any thoughts on that also. I hope that makes sense. So the questions in the chat, Ella's microphone and camera isn't working, so I was wondering your kind of response to that.
Sibusiso and I were articulating at the time, like, what is this? What are we creating? Because obviously we're doing, the process was for us, but then Sibusiso himself was doing the filming, so he was kind of between, because I was on team, so we had, you know, multiple films kind of set up. So sometimes when I was looking at editing aspects of the film, I was going back to the team's recording and going, what was going on over there? And so there was, yeah, anyway. And at the time we're kind of like, okay, we'll provide multiple ways into this so that we can decide how we're going to edit it later. But we're always looking at going, is this a performance or is this film? I mean, and neither of us have a lot of experience in the film industry. So we're kind of going performance art film, this is what it is. But I mean, the layers here that you're introducing, Ella, are incredibly complex. And obviously the actors knew that they were being filmed. So there was an opportunity there for further inhibition, but they slowly got used to it, and you could tell that they became less perturbed by the film. But then by it being filmed, they also knew that there was going to be another output, or at least several other outputs, where their languages and their bodies were going to be, well, that's very binary of me, their linguistic and embodied resources are going to be further amplified through other artistic means. And so that also gave a layer of kind of dignity and a sense of pride, I think, sometimes in the way that they were interacting with their languages. So the film certainly was like another actor, really. And the way that Sibusiso was like interweaving, going between the actors how they were performing was incredible. I wish that I could have just made a film about that. Do you have anything to add, Sibusiso?
No, definitely. I wanted to add actually that, you know, finding myself filming the performance, you know, I felt like I was a performer myself, because I really also needed to be aware of where the actors were moving, because I mean they had the liberty of movement, and I mean to a certain extent you can't ignore the presence of the camera, right? I mean I know this personally as an actor. When I know that there's a camera that is filming me, there's a slight shift, and as much as sometimes you might want to ignore it, but there is that, you know, awareness that there's something that is recording me at that moment, right? But really being the videographer within the whole process, I felt as if the camera in and of itself had its own dance, right? And this dance was really how it was relating, you know, how I was conversing with the other bodies in the space, right? And it was really a shared space, you know, something to talk about as well. You know, there was a shared space between the performers and the camera and myself. Yeah, I mean, if the performers were exhausted after the performance, so was I, because I was heavily, you know, I was heavily involved in it. But yeah, yes, I think that'll be my contribution to that question.
Just unmute myself. I was wondering if anyone else has any questions, to just throw this open slightly. Okay. Right. So I wonder whether we could kind of bring everything together at this point, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, I would just say before this, I mean, Claire and Sibusiso, is there anything else within this kind of process that that you kind of want to share, or do you feel like you've covered most of the things that were kind of important and dear to you?
I think personally, some of the questions that are being asked, you know, are proposing some things that I mean, not that we were not aware of, but I mean, the perspective that everyone is bringing into the conversation is making me, I mean, one of the, like, what we just spoke about now, the fact that I was actually performing in this thing, I think it gives some kind of a further kind of interrogation into the film. I don't think really that the film is complete. I think the film is complete, but I think there is some kind of life for the work, maybe, in the future, and really to see how also some of the work that, I mean, some of the things that we've spoken about, from my research, how they can be interrogated as well. And I mean, in the future, definitely, I mean, we were talking about it with Claire that it would be great to have another project, that we can work on. And hopefully this time, one where we are both in the space physically, just to see how the work can unfold, right? Just to see how that can alter the process, really.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, of course, love this. You had kind of the lockdowns to deal with, so that was a tremendous obstacle. I can see Catherine's, you've got your hand up there.
Well, I put my hand up before you started talking about the future, because I was going to ask you about that, how you saw, where you wanted to go further with this work. So, but maybe you've already answered that now. But for me, it's really fascinating. Yeah. So maybe that's more of a thank you than a question, I think.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so Sibusiso and I plan on building a project together again. We're currently exploring a workshop that will communicate these methods or compositional tools to a conference-based type of audience later in the year. And I see this film really like it's a little gift that provides some documentation of a process that in a way is actually very simple, but it does provide kind of an opportunity for us to have these conversations. I realized when I was preparing for this talk is that I was like, I don't actually really need to prepare much for it because of the film. Like we have these kind of presentations in academia so often where we, present our research. But I was like, the film kind of does it for us, and then we can discern for ourselves what we make from it and how it might be able to be applied to our context, but not necessarily the methods applied to our context, but more the kind of ways in which individuals and performers can come to introduce new interactional approaches within institutions. Because this is the thing, South Africans are incredibly conscious of language rights issues. I mean, they've undergone 300, 400, 500 years, there are many different arguments for all of those, of domination through British and Dutch colonization and apartheid. And so individuals know how to lead the future in where language rights are being protected for all that attend their universities. But institutions are very far away from that. And so it's like performance can provide kind of an opportunity for mediation between those very it feels like they're seemingly separate modes or modalities. And so, yeah, I feel like actually our future projects will just be more conversations and more development of this type of process. There was something I was thinking about before, because a lot of these types of conversations, particularly within Global Language Advocacy Day, are around minorities. And something interesting in South Africa is that it's not necessarily minorities, that it's your language that you speak every day, and it's a national language that's seen within the multilingual constitution of South Africa. And so can you imagine waking up in the morning and having like your national language never spoken within your educational process? It seemed absolutely bizarre. Like I'm not taking away from minority language issues. And this is where South Africans can also inform and and guide minority language issues, because there are greater voices that sometimes it's very hard to ignore, for institutions. So I think that's where the conversation is also quite interesting in terms of looking at majorities and minorities, and how the experiences are different and similar, and how different kind of methodologies can be set up depending on the context. I don't know if any of that made sense, but something I've been thinking about.
Mm.
Thank you, Claire. I can see Oti has got a question. A raised hand, at least.
Mm-hmm.
Hey.
Hey. Well, this is good evening from here. I'm in France, joining you from France, but I'm a Nigerian. So this is quite interesting because it's talking about language rights, from what I can understand from what Claire just said, speaking about language rights. And did I get the name correctly?
Come again? Sibusiso.
Sibusiso, interesting. Sibusiso. Now, okay, I'm Oti. I'm a PhD student, and I'm using a language called Ishekiri language from Nigeria as a case study, working on language endangerment and minority languages. And I find this conversation very interesting. Claire speaking about language rights, and Sibusiso speaking about suggesting some form of identity here, speaking about expressing oneself, some kind of journey to self-discovery, going back to understanding who you are and the rest of that. Yes, those are quite key. But your projects, do you have some form of language maintenance or language revitalization as objective to this process, this using performance to discover oneself? What do you think about language endangerment? What would you want to say about language revitalization or language maintenance as it's got to do with minority languages, for example, in South Africa?
Do you want to jump first? Yeah.
I think firstly, the one thing that is making me very uncomfortable is the idea of a minority language. I don't think, our African languages in South Africa are minorities. I think it depends, which perspective you're viewing it from, which makes it a minority. If anything, they are the majority, because the people that speak it are the majority. And I mean, obviously it is colonization that kind of tried to diminish, them into minor languages, but they're actually giant languages. And I mean, for me, if I was having a conversation with my mentor supervisor, Kgotle, and we were talking about the idea of language and how, these are sounds, right? So Kgotle is a writer and poet and musician. So we were working on a song with him, and he was just speaking about the idea of how he personally, doesn't like, this idea of, being purist in language. Because for him, language is a sound, and sometimes you hear two sounds when you put them together, they create another sound, so for him, he likes to create, sounds, when he puts, he writes in Setswana. He writes in Setswana. So when he recites in Setswana, some of the words, when he listens to them, when he puts the words together, they give him another kind of sonic, discovery, So, I mean, I personally also feel like that, you know, because I was also, what we also discovered is the fact that when you listen to, because we had another singer in within the song, and she was struggling with some of the seSotho words because she's Zulu. But then I told Rafela that the reason why she's struggling is not because she can't take the sound out. It's because when a specific sound is written in seSotho, when you say it in isiZulu, or when you're a Zulu person reading it in seSotho, it sounds differently. So in order for you to get a seSotho person, I mean a Zulu person to say a seSotho sound, you have to write in isiZulu. So for me, there's also a kind of, you know, our languages have a meeting point, and so do cultures. And another thing is that cultures evolve, you know, and as cultures evolve, so does language. You know, for example, Tsotsitaal, you know, I'm from Soweto, you get a lot of Tsotsitaal. You know, it's a formation of different languages meeting, it's people meeting. So when people meet, you know, you're bound to have languages meet as well, you know, to create another sound or another language. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Well, you're talking about sounds so much. Your emphasis is on sounds, but well, you just made your last comment, you talked about language contact. Yes, when languages meet, there's some form of influence. But what I really want to get is whether some of your objectives beside language rights and identity, self-identity, do you have at the bottom of your mind, or some in the future, will you be looking at using your performance-based projects to project, again, using your projects or to project, to encourage language revitalization? Yes, I agree with you and your friend, the word minority language, I mean, it's some kind of colonial designation. I mean, identifying a particular language as minority and the other one as majority, well, in terms of vitality or perhaps in terms of speakers of these languages or in terms of coverage or population. But my worry here is it will be interesting because I'm here in France, I'm looking at the end of my PhD project, I would like to go to Nigeria and start doing something tangible to encourage people. We're talking about decolonization. Encourage people to go back to their mother tongues or perhaps their first languages, because you also use the word hegemony. What's going on in Nigeria today? English is the main language that people use in Nigeria. Families are moving from their mother tongues, first generations, second generations are moving from the mother tongues to English language, or perhaps in Nigeria, maybe you know about the Pidgin English, the Nigerian Pidgin English, which statistically over 100 million persons speak Pidgin English in Nigeria. And that's really huge. And that's really affecting young people, affecting children, which is some factor or suggesting language endangerment, suggesting some of these, whether you like it or not, the minority languages. But for me, I use the word heritage language. So some of these heritage languages are endangered, or rather, they're on the verge, they're attrited, they're suffering from attrition, they're declining. So would you suggest, do you think your projects, your performance projects, is something that could be used to revitalize some of these languages? Or is it something that could be used to get people back to using their language? Can it be? Again, in Nigeria, it may interest you to know that there are lots of performance, there are lots of, what do I call them now? I'm not in Nigeria, but these guys, they use a lot of Pidgin English in filmmaking, but they hardly use, well, the majority languages, Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba are used in filmmaking, but not the minority, not the smaller languages. So do you think is there anything one can do? Would you want to use your performing arts to express or to encourage language maintenance?
Yes.
How is that possible? How would you encourage that? How is that possible?
Maybe I don't have the question of how it's possible, but I think the project does do that, because I'm looking back at Moeketsi's experience as a participant as well of the project. In order for him to really get the articulation of the poem, right, he had to go back home to his grandfather, right, to go and kind of get the articulation and the kind of, what's this thing, the meaning behind it. But also what was interesting is that, we struggled, to translate that poem into English, because it has no English equivalent, which was an interesting thing, right? When you try and translate it into English, it loses its meaning. And I think for me, that's why I was finding, and I understand where you're coming from, Oti. I understand where you're coming from. And that's why I was saying, these languages are not really minorities, because if you really understand, the power that is embedded, in our languages, these languages carry wisdom, that these languages carry, music, our languages carry music, they are sonic, representations of who we are, right? And really, I think there is a sense of, like I said, when we go back and find who we are, for example, if you check my name is Kabazela. I remember when I was speaking, it was Claire, when we were having our Zoom meeting, she was like, who's Kabazela? And I told her that Kabazela is a clan name, right? So understanding really, something like your clan name, you are understanding your roots, but you're also understanding the power of language, because our clan names are poetic. They carry so much meaning, they carry so much wisdom. They speak to ideas of where we come from and what our ancestors did. It's like a story if you think about it. So I think the project does, it can fulfill that role, to kind of revive, to kind of, and this is what we're doing also with the theatre and performance department at Wits, especially at second year level, when we really encourage students, we encourage them to use their mother tongue when they create, right? Because also the work, we're looking at personal stories. We are looking at work that comes from the space of the self, right? And it's that expression of self. And with that expression of self, we push the idea of really using your mother tongue. Because also sometimes what I've realized that when it's time to prescribe, some of the work, some of the words that are in our own languages are limited. So we are really also pushing for that, for students to write in their home language, in their mother tongues, so that the canon of work also, grows, for future generations as well. Yeah.
Is it okay if I add something to that for you, OT? So in terms of language maintenance and revitalisation, it's something that I've been akin to through some performance work in Australia, because it's used quite a lot there when talking about Indigenous Australian languages, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. And when framing this project, I was looking at it more towards sustainability of languages, because I felt like that was a really useful way of understanding languages across the spectrum of how small or big they are, how much they're growing, how much they're shrinking. Because sometimes I feel like a language maintenance and revitalization aim can be so emotionally led, and that's fine, but it can then put to the side the importance of languages in contact, right? And languages always changing. And I think it's an absolutely important goal, but within our project, I was like, I'm unsure if I should be making that case, because isiZulu has actually been growing as a language. It's instead looking at the sustainability in the lives of the people that are studying, and how they're going to have an influence in their future lives, and how, you know, that learning in English will then mean that they will perform in English, and will mean that they will have the tendency to interact in English in their professional lives. You know, it has such an influence. And so instead looking at the sustainability of the not just the languages, but the speakers. And I think the language revitalization field, because it's also been set up through a fairly Anglo-Saxon mindset within Canada and Australia and the United States, I think it has a tendency to like have an outcome, like we must get to that point. But instead I feel like we should look at the individuals and what they have the potential for, and how languages can be harnessed in order to give them that potential, for them to provide it for themselves, you know, and the giving, as I try to avoid, but I was thinking about the institution and how they can allow for more multilingual or translanguaging pedagogies.
Yeah, you're right. When you talk about language sustainability, it could also lead to language maintenance, because when these young people, young students use their language, they're encouraged to write in their language, they're encouraged to perform in the languages. When they go back home, they use the languages at home, they perhaps encourage others to use the language. That's language sustainability. And at the end of the day, by extension, there could be some form of language maintenance. Yes. So thank you for your time and for answering my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's lovely to meet you.
Me too.
Thank you so much for that intervention. I did have a final question. In some ways you've answered it, but it just gives you a chance really to maybe just kind of to give you the floor really, and because you know, I was so interested in is the links between multilingualism, the body, and performing arts. That, I mean, that's the thing I felt like I've really taken away from this. I was interested in how, in the end, your cultural histories inform this and help to shape the future. Now, you said a few words, but perhaps it gives you a chance to kind of summarize some of those things.
So definitely, cultural histories. I go back again using Moeketsi as a case study, rather. You know, really going back in history, because it's the poem is actually a real event that happened when his grandfather actually fought a hippo to save his family, right? So it's you know, it's the history of his family, and you know, but also, you know, we are celebrating the beauty of language in that, you know. So, and like I said, you know, we were really drawing from ideas of ritual, you know, going back, you know, to the roots, going back, you know, ngesiZulu sithi mazibuyele emasisweni, you know, going back to where it belongs, right? And really channeling that into the work, because we are also speaking about the body as a site of performance. Really, how can, you know, yeah, how the body engages with the work, you know, from a ritualistic perspective. But also for me, the idea of, you know, using, you know, multi-languages in this piece, you know, using isiZulu, seSotho, and Ndebele, you know, brought a sense of unity, right? And as much as these are different languages that are being used, but, you know, there's a unifying agenda, there's a unifying mandate, which is self-expression. But also, like we said earlier on, you know, that heartbeat also became a kind of unifying force. And the heartbeat was the rhythm. and how this rhythm was also found in these different kind of languages, right? I mean, Professor Samuel Ravengai has an article where he speaks about the body as a site of performance, you know, from a kind of Eurocentric versus an Afrocentric perspective. And, you know, from a Eurocentric, at most times what you would find is that, you know, the ideas of singing, dance, and acting, at most times, you know, they are viewed under different umbrellas. But when you come into an Afrocentric, you know, space, these kind of aesthetics are one. You know, in Zulu we say sigiya ngengoma, so we dance with song, right? We cannot converse, we cannot pray, we cannot, you know, engage if we have not sung. You know, when you think about, you know, the ancient storyteller, Credo Mutwa, you know, speaks about the shaman as a storyteller. You know, when the shaman goes into a trance, you know, it is the beating of the drums, it is the song that is sung, you know, it is the stomping of the feet, you know, that sends those electrifying kind of impulses in the body that allows the shaman to get into the space where he or she or they, you know, can tell the story, right? So the body really becomes that site of performance. But it's also the idea of taking care of the body. You know, our forefathers used to really take care of their bodies, right? The idea of detoxing the body. There's a reason why we detox our bodies, right? Because so much, you know, mucus, so much, you know, toxins sit in the body, and when those toxins, you know, accumulate in the body, they kind of close the mind of the body, which I believe sits right here in the core, right? The impulses die. So really the body as a site of performance, you know, is something that we really looked at, you know, and how it kind of, you know, houses these different kind of aesthetics, you know, storytelling, mime, you know, into one. And yeah.
Thank you so much. Such a great answer. Just, I mean, any final questions from anyone else here? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I think this is a good moment to tie things together. I'm quite conscious as well of the kind of you know, it's the evening, and you know, maybe, you know, the time differences and these type of things. First of all, thank you so much, Sibusiso and Claire. Really, the things that I think I'll always take away from this, I mean, I'll say your words back to you, because I think that's kind of the most kind of profound things. Claire, you talk about the gift. I think you definitely shared a gift with us all, and it's kind of, you know, it's a kind of chronicle that we can come back to many times, and hopefully you will too, Sibusiso. You know, I've learned so much and really opened my mind in terms of thinking about the role of the heart, which is also, you know, quite similar in my own culture, which I've never drawn on in the same way. So you definitely enlightened me to think more openly within my, you know, my own culture, and taking that forward. Thank you to everyone for attending this event. It is part of Global Language Advocacy Day 2 as well, which is there are ongoing events which will carry on, particularly on the 22nd of February. We had to adjust the date for this, but we're equally grateful to have you all here. So thank you so much, and I think good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cameron. It's been delightful.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Sibusiso. Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Good night.
That was great. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. I'll stop recording. How do I stop recording? Oh, there it is. Yeah. Yes.